In 2007, a 44-year-old man in France went to his local hospital because his left leg felt weak. He was not alarmed. He was not in serious pain. He had a wife, 2 children, a steady job as a civil servant, and a life that by any ordinary measure seemed completely normal. Doctors examined him and ordered a brain scan, a routine procedure to rule out anything unusual. And what appeared on that scan caused the room to go completely silent. The man's skull was not filled with a brain. It was filled almost entirely with fluid. Where the vast majority of his brain tissue should have been, the cortex, the deep structures, the regions that neuroscientists had long believed were essential for consciousness, personality, memory, and basic human function, there was almost nothing. By the most conservative estimate, this man was missing somewhere between 50 and 75% of his brain. By some measurements, closer to 90%. He had been living this way for his entire life, and he had absolutely no idea. This is not a story from science fiction. It is not an exaggeration. It was published in The Lancet, one of the most respected medical journals in the world, in 2007, and it has been challenging neuroscientists, cognitive psychologists, and philosophers of consciousness ever since. Because what this man's existence implies about the human brain is something that our current science genuinely cannot fully explain. And his story is not even the most extreme case of what the human brain, or what remains of it, is capable of surviving. To understand why this case is so astonishing, you need to understand what the medical community believed about the brain before cases like this began to emerge. For most of the history of neuroscience, the prevailing model of the brain was relatively straightforward. Specific regions perform specific functions, and damage to those regions produces specific and predictable losses. The visual cortex processes sight. The motor cortex controls movement. The hippocampus handles memory formation. Damage the right area and you lose the corresponding function. This model is not wrong. It has enormous explanatory power and has guided medicine effectively for over a century. But it has a hidden assumption buried inside it. It assumes that the brain is a relatively fixed structure, that what you are born with is essentially what you have, that the loss of tissue means the loss of function. The Frenchman's case, and others like it, suggest that assumption is far more complicated than anyone realized. The man's condition had a name and a history. As an infant, he had been diagnosed with hydrocephalus, a condition where cerebrospinal fluid builds up abnormally inside the skull, creating pressure that slowly, over years, compresses and displaces brain tissue. A shunt was inserted into his head as an infant to drain the fluid. The shunt was eventually removed when at age 14 he complained of left leg weakness and some unsteadiness. After that, he simply got on with his life. The fluid continued to accumulate slowly, so slowly, over so many decades that his brain had time to adapt in ways that medicine still cannot fully account for. The tissue that remained reorganized itself. Functions that would normally require large amounts of neural real estate were compressed, redistributed, maintained by a fraction of the expected circuitry. His IQ was tested at 84, slightly below the normal range, but he was perfectly socially apt, emotionally functional, and entirely unaware that anything was unusual about his inner life. Oddity Central Goodreads, when cognitive psychologist Axel Clearmans of the Université Libre in Brussels studied this case and presented it at a major consciousness conference. He described it as one of the most radical challenges to existing theories of how consciousness works that science had ever encountered. If consciousness, the sense of being a self, of being aware, of experiencing the world, requires specific brain structures to exist, then this man should not be conscious. and yet he clearly was. He had opinions. He had memories. He loved his family. He went to work. He experienced joy and frustration and boredom and everything else that makes a human life, with 90% of the structure that is supposed to generate all of that gone. But extraordinary as his case is, it is not the only one of its kind. Mora was 9 months old when surgeons removed the entire left hemisphere of her brain. Not damaged it, not partially affected it, removed it entirely. A procedure called a hemispherectomy, performed as a last resort to stop catastrophic seizures that were threatening her life. The left hemisphere of the human brain is, by conventional neuroscience, the seat of language. It is where speech is processed, where grammar is understood, where words are produced. Removing it entirely should, by any prior understanding, have made meaningful language impossible. Lad, at 15, Mora plays soccer, tells jokes, and in many ways lives the life of a typical teenager. Her speech is slow and careful, one visible sign of a brain that has had to completely rewire its language processing from scratch, using the right hemisphere to do jobs that hemisphere was never originally designed to handle. But she speaks. She communicates. She laughs. She has a personality and a sense of humor and plans for her future. Her right hemisphere, the half that remained, looked at the job that needed to be done and found a way to do it. Scientists call this neuroplasticity. In Mora's case, and in the Frenchman's case, it operated at a scale that no textbook had prepared anyone for. Lad, what do these cases tell us? They tell us that the brain is not a fixed machine where the loss of a part means the permanent loss of a function. They tell us that given time, and especially when the process begins early enough, the brain can reorganize itself in ways that are genuinely staggering. They tell us that our models of consciousness and brain function, as sophisticated as they have become, are still missing something fundamental. Something that a 44-year-old civil servant with almost no brain tissue and a teenage girl with half a brain are both demonstrating, simply by going about their lives. The Frenchman still lives with his family. He still goes to work. He is still, by any meaningful definition, himself, conscious, present, and entirely unaware that his existence is one of the most profound medical puzzles of the 21st century. And that, perhaps, is the most remarkable thing of all. We cover the most mind-blowing true stories from around the world every single week. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications because you will not want to miss what is coming next. See you in the next one.